introduction. So can you see my screen, please? And can you see it on, can you see the slides moving back and forth, please?
Yes.
Great, that's fine. Because sometimes, the slides don't move back and forth. So just let me know if something like that happens. So Assalamu alaikum everyone and good afternoon. I'm, like Anish has said, I'm with the sociology department at FC College. This is a wonderful picture of our campus over here because I see their registrants from out of city. So you can see we're very lucky to work at a very beautiful campus. So today we have a lot to cover and I did receive the registrants' questions. So I've tried my best to incorporate everything. I hope that I'm able to satisfy everyone. Otherwise, there's a question and answer session, and then there's also my email address. I'm always willing to answer questions that may have been missed out because we only have a 1 hour session. Another thing is that this presentation and its supplementary reading material will be with Anish, and I hope she'll sure, and I'm sure she will be sharing it with all of you. So again, if there are any questions building from that, I'm happy to answer them from email. So the first thing that we'll do together is we'll address the questions by the registrants. Then we'll talk about some common mistakes in proposal writing, which we've learned about from other scholars, which can help us to prevent mistakes even if we're first-time grant writers. The third area will be recommendations and preparation stages and checklists that we'll be using, making the transition from academic writing to grant writing. And finally, we'll move to the second part of the presentation, which is talking about each and every section and just very quickly going through how to start writing those subsections of your proposal. Which seem to be very daunting, but once you get in the nitty gritty and once you start doing it, especially with a team together, it's not so difficult and it's not so challenging anymore. So I think the first time writers usually feel that it's too difficult, and the transition between PhD writing of a thesis and dealing with your supervisors versus writing to externals and outsiders is too much of a transition. It's too much of trouble, but it's really not. This is my recommendation and personal opinion. Okay, so I received a question, how do you apply for funding? This is a tricky question that we all, even those who've received funding, we're going through this challenge on a daily basis because there are new funding institutes, there are new funding priority areas that are emerging on a daily basis. So the first thing is to be creative and flexible in your approach to seeking funding. Don't just look in one place, look in multiple places. Don't use just one social media platform, but use multiple. So let's say, don't just talk to your university research office. Definitely talk to them, but then also talk to your peers and your colleagues, people working in your specialization areas in other universities. Take a look at some of their backgrounds and their publications where they talk about their research funding bodies. Because if somebody in your research specialization area has received a funding from a certain institute, you're more likely to get it from that institute as well because you're working in the same area. So, and then also looking not just from the government sector, but also the private sector. Regularly visiting the website and social media. Twitter is a very popular social media resource nowadays in contemporary times, which regularly has alerts and messages about funding bodies. And, using those, I'm not very good with social media as well, but, using the hash term, hash funding or hash grant allocations, and a lot of things will pop out. So we have to get into this is like a culture, like behavior modification. You have to get into the habit of seeking funding on a weekly basis. Another thing is that if you have a team, then if there is a team of 4 or 5 of you and all of you are looking simultaneously, it's great to remind each other to keep looking, and then somebody or the other will come up with something eventually. Also, it's painful. It's a painful journey. People are applying for modifying their proposals and applying for grants for many years. I personally have a proposal for special needs children and development content for their safety, and this is just for blind and deaf children because we couldn't go beyond that. And it's a wonderful proposal, and Madam Khatija and I have been circulating it for many years now, and we've not received the funding for it. So this happens with everybody, but we don't give up, we keep trying. Another thing that really helps is to modify your proposal into two different lengths, let's say, or two different sample frames, because funding, you'll get small funding alerts and you'll get large funding alerts. So having a project that has been adapted into two different versions, a smaller version with a smaller scale, a smaller frame of study, more like a pilot project versus a larger proposal. That way you can submit to simultaneous bodies. And the great news is that, you know how with academic research papers, you can only submit to one place and you have to wait for rejection. With proposals, research proposals, there's no such limitation. You can simultaneously submit to many parties and institutes, grant institutes. Another really helpful factor is to not only have multiple researchers working on the team together, but having non-profit sectoral collaborators working with you. So let's say I'm from FC College and I've got a research partner or sectoral collaborator from the University of Punjab and somebody from the University of Health Sciences. And most recently, we were lucky to get a grant from HEC where our sectoral collaborators are UNICEF and the Primary Healthcare Department of Pakistan. So such sectoral collaborators, whether they are your fiscal sponsors or they're going to contribute in your auditing or your administration or help you to liaise for data collection, in whatever capacity that they're helping you for the ultimate project, the truth is that they also help you in actually gaining the funding, because the more stronger your team is, the more likelihood of you being reviewed and you receiving the grant. So somebody asked the question, well, what kind of areas have I got funding from? And also again, a question where somebody said that well, social sciences and gender researchers don't get funding grants. Well, this is changing. You can see that my first research grant that I received in 2019 was on women microfinance borrowers and the impact of their on their quality of life of loan taking. So this is a gender-based research, it's a social science research, and it got a grant. The research after that got a grant was on elderly people and an intervention that contributed to the intergenerational learning with university students to assess whether there was any improvement in their well-being and also what kind of conditions that they lived in public sector old age homes. And this was also something very unusual that social science received a grant, a social science project and a project on elderly people, because it's usually just considered that elderly will be looked after within the families. But things are changing in Pakistan and there is need for good public sector care provision for elderly populations. And then you can see in the these recent three have mostly, no, the one in the middle over here received a grant from Shahid Hussain Foundation. So this is private sector giving grants for the impact of a nurse intervention for patient infection control and patient safety practices during the era of COVID, but then even beyond as well, because nurses really are frontline in managing infection. And the last two projects that have been mentioned, one of them received the grant from Doctors, which is a private organization, but also in partnership with the University of Health Sciences. So it was like a joint grant by the public sector and the private sector. And the most recent grant that I've received is from the Higher Education Commission, again on women's reproductive health services, and it's a health and social literacy. So I'm just going to remove this because I can't see my screen. Right. And to conclude, basically, this is not a fair argument anymore that social sciences or gender researchers or if you want to do research on the microfinance sector, elderly people, that you're not going to be received. It's really how strong your proposal are. No doubt we get very low allocation of funds. The larger base may be streamed to the life sciences or the technological innovation sector, computer sciences. But it's not that the social sciences are bereft altogether, and we have to, and multidisciplinary teams make a difference as well. So we move on, and yes, and another question that came from the participants was, well, what kind of proposal headings should we take into account when we're drafting our proposal? Well, the good news is that usually funding bodies give you a template with their own subject headings or their subheadings or their content areas. But having said that, when you're at base stage and you're drafting the proposal yourself, then there's no harm in taking a look at the classic or standard HEC proposal headings. You'll see that they have an executive summary, they have a priority area of national relevance. They're asking you immediately about your academic, before even your methodology, who your academic collaborators are, who your sectoral collaborators are, and that's how important it is to them. What your project description is, how you'll be managing your project, so you can add your organogram over here, what your timeline is going to be like, who's going to support you for physical resources and facilities. Is it going to be the research institute where the faculty is applying from, or somebody else? What your project weaknesses or limitations are at launch, and how you will manage or plan a risk strategy to minimize those weaknesses and limitations. And finally, what's the history of research grant availed by the principal investigator? Now I'm going to take a pause and I'm going to take you into priority national areas of relevance, because another issue is that no matter how creative we want to be, when we're applying to HEC and the government of Pakistan, it's better that we apply under their national relevance areas. Otherwise, our initial application might not go through. So if you can see, Anish, can you see this website, the new screen that I've shared? Anybody, participants?
Yes.
Great. So you can see that under the social, behavioral, and economic sciences, and I'm sorry, we won't have time to go, there are separate headings for humanities and life sciences, but we don't have much time. But this is publicly available data on HEC website, where they're telling you that their national priority areas of relevance come under economic stability, growth and development, agricultural productivity and food security, water management and sustainability, sustainable energy, sociology and philosophy, urban planning, climate change and environment, IT and telecom, innovative governance and reforms. And I recently won a grant under this sector, innovator, so primary healthcare development and partnership of the Lady Health Worker Program. And you can see that under each of these headings there's a little bit more detail and more subcomponents which will help you to guide and plan a proposal that will actually be reviewed and accepted by HEC. So let me go back and you guys see my presentation again in PowerPoint mode, and the next slide. Can you see the slide which is cited by Wisdom and Colleagues 2015? Great.
Yes.
Thank you so much. So some recommendations for successful grant proposal writings from international literature. We've taken a look at what Pakistan HEC is telling us, and now this is the time also to take a look at international literature in case you want to apply simultaneously to HEC, your local government, local private organizations, but then also internationally as well. And you'll notice that here they've told us that the recommendation is number one, to identify appropriate funding opportunities. And again, make sure that you read your funding data, what the funding institute has written in terms of selection criteria, what they're looking forward to in terms of the team that is working together, etc., etc. So read of that carefully. If it doesn't apply to you, if it doesn't suit you, if you're not eligible, then obviously move on, but don't waste your time. So, one reason why people get exhausted that we applied for funding once, but then we're not going to do it again because we got rejected, is usually because they didn't apply to multiple places, or they applied to a place where they were not eligible. Another really important area is using key components of the proposal to persuade reviewers about the project's significance and feasibility. It's a great idea actually to have a separate section, this project significance. And then the feasibility is something that the reviewers are going to be reading throughout, especially when they're reading your methodology section in terms of data collection, sampling, and data analysis. If at any point they feel that this is too exaggerated or it's too ambitious and it's not something that is doable, then that means it wasn't, that your proposal is going to get rejected basically. Then describing your proposal activities and their significance clearly and concisely. Clarity is very important, because if your reader and the reviewer is not able to understand, then you're going to face obviously rejection again. Now here what helps is that, because usually the principal investigator is thinking of multiple things, they've done an elaborate literature review, they're writing as much as possible, is to get your proposal reviewed by your own team members or by peers, by senior colleagues. I was very lucky that I always asked my dean to review my proposal, and he very quickly used to, God bless Dr. Sikandar, he very quickly is able to catch on to things that don't, that that are too ambitious, that are not clear enough, that need to be removed temporarily, that are just extra for now, and so getting the right people to review your proposal before you actually submit it is something that you need to do, and you have to be lucky enough to have the right people to give you time for this. So seeking advice from colleagues, and then making sure that the proposal and the project has long-term potential, because the government sector and even an international funding body is not going to sponsor something that has temporary impact or that does not have long-term significance for the national economy or for the global village that we live in. Your literature review, and somebody has mentioned this in the registrants questions, that please tell us how to draft a literature review, so we'll get to that. Having a clear and a comprehensive literature review that clearly identifies research gaps, and then also clearly identifies and comprehensively covers what has already been done in this area. So one common mistake is to write in your literature review or somewhere in your proposal that this has never been done before. And immediately your reviewer will search for something and say, hey, 2 years ago, somebody has already done this. It's better, even if you want to do that project, it's better to do a comprehensive literature review, say that somebody did this 2 years ago, these were the limitations and these are the gaps that we are covering, or they did it in another country and we need to do it in Pakistan, or they did it in the rural sector, we need to do it in the urban sector. But rather than to just completely miss your literature review altogether and be in a situation where your reviewers are coming back to you and saying, well, you have not done a proper literature review, and people have actually done this before. Having your budget, and I like, and I've underlined the past, which says that it should be an honest portrayal of the funding that the team needs to successfully carry out their work. Because obviously when the reviewers are taking a look and they see that maybe you've given an allocation to an area, these people are experienced. Reviewers who are looking at taking a look at your proposal, sometimes they jumps, or they're specifically allocated to look at your budget. And if they think that you're asking for something unnecessarily, they're going to think either that you're inexperienced, you haven't had your budget checked by your own internal budget finance team. So if you're a faculty researcher and you're drafting a proposal, the good news is you can go to your finance department, your purchasing department, and you can discuss your budget with them. And they will give you better information about whether you've got the right receipts and the right planning for purchasing, or are you over estimating, or you're underestimating. And then we've talked about having interdisciplinary and sectoral collaborators. Very quickly, we're going to talk about 12 points related to common mistakes for rejection. This has been summarized by Kikila in 2007. So now, number one, having an unsatisfactory or a title that lacks focus. Now, sometimes what happens is that you have a great proposal, but the title does not reflect what you're actually intending to do. And I'll keep talking about my common mistakes. I once wrote a title, something related to, for improving maternal and child health through a health and social literacy intervention. I'm talking about my most recent grant that I won. And immediately a senior consultant, senior a dean, Dr. Coster, highlighted, well, you need to include pre and post test in this title. Otherwise, it makes no sense about how you're going to actually be measuring the impact. So immediately I realized that this was something that I missed out simply because I was trying to write a short title. So sometimes your title is too long, sometimes it's too short, but it needs to be focused, but it also needs to include all the relevant information. Then introducing the proposal. Now, this could be your executive summary as well. It has to be satisfactorily written. It should be clear. There should be good language, and there should be as much information as possible. A common mistake that I've made, I had 4 aspects of a study: the pre-test, post-test intervention, the baseline data that was going to be collected at 3 different points, a community needs assessment report, and finally, an interprofessional team delivery for intervention that we were going to deliver to the intervention facilitators. And not the client. The pre-test, post-test for the health and social literacy was for the clients, but the people who were going to deliver the intervention and the services in the future, for them, there was an interprofessional team building and collaboration intervention as well. Now, when I wrote my executive summary, the first time, the first draft, I wrote about the pre-test, post-test, I wrote about the baseline, but I completely, and I think I purposely did it, I thought it's too much to include the community needs assessment and the interprofessional team building intervention in the executive summary, because I had only 1 page. But then again, I had great collaborators who were reviewing this, and they said, well, even if you do it in a line, but it should go in the executive summary. So then making a very strong proposal, because again, different, I've heard about this, that different reviewers are in the team. One is focused to looking at your budget, another may be focused at looking at your methodology, and another may be focused just at looking at your introduction, your literature review, and your executive summary. So each has to be strong. And the first draft that we have of our proposal is usually suffers from the problem of, which is true for everyone, that maybe there's too much information, some section is strong, whereas others are weak. So this takes time. Usually we hear about a funding alert and we say, okay, we have 15 days now to prepare something. And we do it without having enough people review the proposal before we submit it. And then we're sending a lopsided proposal. The project and the idea may be great, but the write-up isn't great, and thus the rejection. Having a good and clear problem statement, having appropriate and relevant research problems, and if you're applying to a government body and they've already outlined relevant areas of priority, then specifically addressing those, having clear research objectives and hypothesis building, which comes from the literature. You're not just making them up yourself, because hypothesis is built on a statement of a problem, existing work that has been done, which you intend to go and retest into the field. So please, making sure you're clear. I've heard of proposals being rejected simply because the research objectives and the hypotheses that have been written down in the methodology are incorrect, or they're undoable. They're not feasible. Adequacy of literature review, appropriate methods and research instruments. So if you're developing your own scale, if you're using standardized scales, attaching your appendices, your surveys, having all your appendices ready for your proposal submission is very important. It cannot be mentioned enough. So sometimes we have the proposal and the write-up, but there's no clarity about how we're actually going to be delivering the intervention, what scales we'll be using, what our pre-test, post-test survey is going to look like, what our content for the awareness and the literacy intervention is like. So having all of those appendixes ready and then submitting it with your main proposal and then referencing those appendices in your proposal is very important. This is also a step that we commonly miss out on. Talking about, and then the last 4 points, talking about the strengths of the principal investigators and their collaborators, highlighting your budget, your timeline, including your budget and your timeline. Now, with longer projects, people usually tend to say, we'll skip the timeline. It's impossible to tell what we're going to be doing for the next 5 years, but don't do that. Either have an annual timeline, or better yet, have a quarterly timeline. And if you can have a monthly timeline, then there's nothing like it. Also, please include a section related to plans for dissemination. So even if your template that is coming through from the grant body, it does not have a separate section for this, you can include it in a couple of lines that you, for example, plan to have meetings with stakeholders, have a conference for dissemination, publish your data on a website and make it available for other researchers to use. And then obviously publishing in academic journals. All of this is really important for the funding body to recognize that you have plans, that your findings and your results will actually be circulated and disseminated, and they'll be there available for lifetime after we're gone. So we move to Koppelman and Holloway, and a sort of guide that they've asked us to take a look at carefully and consider before we actually launch into the proposal writing. So people usually think that proposal writing comes first, but according to Koppelman, these questions need to be answered first before we actually sit down and try to start writing our proposal. Number one, does our team have the relevant skills and knowledge? Number two, do we need additional training, or do we need to recruit new personnel? Let's say we say that we're going to start our proposal and we're going to do a pilot test, but who's going to deliver that pilot? Who's going to actually make the Excel sheets for us or help us in making the appendices and the surveys? And do we need to train somebody to do that with us? Do we getting our sectoral collaborators on board? This is the time that you do it before you actually write the proposal. Do I need to join, do we, the principal investigators or just one investigator, need to join a grant writing skills workshop? Because there's a big difference. There's going to be a slide that we cover some elements related to this, but we as researchers are trained as students as well to do good thesis writing, to make the transition for research article publications, for book writing. But writing a research proposal is like another fourth area, and it's another world, and it's another skill. And sometimes you need to attend a workshop. And I think that's what we're doing together today as well. Are you ready to be a full investigator, or do you need co-investigators? Do you need a mentor? Do you need senior consultants? And who's going to give you enough time related to this? So these are all the questions that go before the actual literature review and proposal writing. You may have a broad idea of a research question or an area, but you need to answer these questions first. We've talked about this. So here's making the transition from academic writing to grant writing. And I'm just going to talk about the column titled grant writing. So here with grant writing, instead of being individualistic, you have to have a service attitude. You're going to start talking about, thinking about your sponsor, who my sponsor is, who I'm writing. Am I applying to WHO? Am I applying to UNICEF? Am I applying to University of Health Sciences? Is it a government sector? Is it a private sector? What are they looking at? You have to start thinking about them. You have to be future oriented. You have to see whether this is something that you can do in the next 5 years. One example of this is that when we were doing an intervention for the lady health workers, we had to cut down our intervention because we had not planned that for the pandemic. We didn't realize that even if we got extra money and gave everybody, masks and hand sanitizers, there was still concern with social distancing, where people would not open doors and be part of the project. So we had to shift to more cross-sectional data, and we had to delay the intervention for a later period. So future-oriented, we have to keep thinking about whether this is something that can be done. If it's going to take 1 year for the proposal to be gained, then if we're going to collect data 2 years after that and deliver the intervention, will we be able to do it? It should be project centered. There should be objectives and activities, and they should be detailed. And a very good table that we usually write together is what the project is and who the team member is leading it and how many other resources that we need. I'm gonna share that with you later. And then it should be team focused oriented. Writing for grants is really not something you should be doing alone. There should be a team with you, and it should be multidisciplinary. I've always been lucky to have people from education, economics, mass communications, public health, medical doctors coming and working with me. And that's the only reason I've been able to get grants. If I had applied alone, I wouldn't have gotten it. Usually the template that is provided to you by your funding body has restricted word counts. So you should adhere to those. You shouldn't say, well, I've written my original proposal draft is like, I don't know, 100 pages. So I have to fit all of this in. Please follow their rules and regulations as much as possible. And this we're usually used to because we're writing academic journal articles and they also have their restrictions. And then make sure that your language is accessible. Everybody from different disciplines can understand it. This happens a lot, that in social sciences, we use language or keywords, which are very familiar to us. They're academically approved. They're part of our academic journal publications. But when somebody from the life sciences or humanities read it, they interpret it in a different way. And so if we are using language which is very focused towards our area, our subject area, then make sure that you have conceptual definitions written and included in your proposal very early on. Or if you can substitute with a key word or key phrase, academic phrase, which is understandable to all genres, then use that instead, right? A good example of this is significant others. A lot of people don't understand when you use the word significant others, whereas sociologists and social scientists understand it very quickly. And the advice usually is from others, people from public health and life sciences have told me that instead of using the phrase significant others, just use family or kin or immediate relatives, because that's something we all understand. So we're just going to quickly talk about a checklist by Davy. Now, this is something that should be your bedtime reading, I call this. This is your bedtime reading, which will keep you focused and on track. So don't think that checklists are only for research projects, but checklists are also for research proposal making. If you're not happy with Davy, there are a couple of other ones which you can download and use. But you can see that over here, the checklist is constantly prompting you. Number one, what is the importance of your research? Number two, what's the scientific potential? What are the research plans? We can't talk about all of them, but I'm just going to talk about the questions that the checklist is prompting you for the research plans 2.2. How innovative is the proposal? How creative is it? And at the same time, is it falling under a national priority area or a priority area that has been highlighted by the funding body? Are the experimental plans realistic? Is it you will actually be able to do? Have people been able to do it in your country or in this region before? Going to face cultural or legal barriers where you're
Dr.
not, you heard a
Sarah,
proposal was not good, or
Dr. Sarah, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
the
your voice is breaking. Can you please repeat your last sentence?
okay.
It's not audible. I think there is some connectivity issue. She will join just in a while. Please wait. Thank you. Meanwhile, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. You're on mute, Dr. Sarah. We can see your screen. There's no voice.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes,
I'm so
absolutely.
sorry I got disconnected. Is it on your end or my end? Because my internet is pretty strong.
I think it was on your end.
Okay, I'm
Can
so
you please
sorry
repeat
about
the
it.
last point? No problem at all. It's okay.
I was saying that this is Davy's proposal checklist. You're free to use another one, but do use a checklist. It's a good bedtime reading to keep prompting yourself about any salient issues that should not be missed from your proposal. One, we have time to just cover the 2.2 research plans, which constantly asks you, is the proposal innovative? Are the experimental plans realistic? Are the methods competitive with the best in the field? And I'll give you one example each for this. Have major scientific, technical, organizational challenges been identified? So number one, innovative, the proposal is, this is linked to your literature review. If somebody has already done something like this 1 month ago and you've not reviewed it and you're claiming to do something that nobody else has done before, this is going to be a problem. How the experimental plans are realistic. Now, this is very important in terms of, let's say you're aiming to deliver an intervention and then you claim that the intervention, let's say, is about something that has too many cultural barriers, i.e. the field is not going to be receptive of you delivering this intervention. So this is very important over here. This is a common problem in the gender research, where you claim to deliver an intervention, but when you go into the field, you need to do a pilot test first. You realize that doorstep services related to certain elements of reproductive health will be accepted, whereas others will not. And then, are the methods and study designs competitive? Let's say you claim to be using Cronbach alpha or non-parametric tests, when the actual tests that you should be using are parametric and that can actually measure impact and change. So here your methodology, write up your data analysis is very important. So these are some of the examples of what your proposal checklist will constantly be asking you or prompting you to consider and include in your proposal. Uh, we've completed our first part, and our second part is what the registrants had requested, which is like talk about individual sections each for your proposal. So if there are no questions, I'll continue. These are the individual sections of a research proposal, an actual proposal that got a funding grant. Should I continue? Or
Yes, please. Yes, please
okay.
continue.
This is a typical flow of research headings for a research proposal, and I'm going to talk about every section of these, uh, all of these subsections. The first is a theoretical framework. This is really important. Surprisingly, a lot of research proposals completely omit the theoretical framework. And you can see that a proposal, this is basically a research project that won a grant for investigating women microfinance borrowers and whether their loan taking actually empowers them in terms of improvement in different aspects of their quality life, like their family relations, their self decision making, decisions for their children, small household decision making, large decision making, etc., etc. We use the WHO call framework. It won a grant. It was surprising again because it's gender and social sciences, but we won it. And the theoretical framework that we used for this project was the framework for assessing behavioral healthcare. So, academic research not having a theoretical framework is just the worst thing. You must have your theoretical framework. And you'll notice that in this theory, basically they tell us that health behavior has two classifications: environmental factors and healthcare delivery. And under these two broad headings, we were able to then identify subcomponents. Like under the environment element, we identified social factors like marital relations, spousal relations, whether they lived in a nuclear family or a joint family, physical and mental health conditions, whether they suffered from any chronic disease burden or stress, and economic conditions, what their personal income was like, what their family income was like, whether they were taking any health insurance, life insurance, whether they had a savings plan. And then under these, we were able to identify standardized scales. We had to modify them for regional relevancy to measure what was actually happening with the women in the community, i.e. women who were the poorest of the poor, debt-ridden, taking microfinance loans in the community, and repaying back loans. But the having said this, something that I need to share with all of you is that microfinance women borrowers are basically given loan to start small businesses. So that was also a question that we included. Are you actually utilizing that loan for small businesses and income generation? And then is that income actually helping you? So one of our findings was that many women were actually taking the loan and not using it for small businesses, but handing it over to their relatives or their male relatives, their son, their husband, their father, so that they could do businesses. And so obviously that loan was a loan that a woman was taking, but it was not empowering or benefiting or building her capacity. It was being handed over. And then another aspect, because the research question was what was their health quality of life like after loan taking. So the theoretical framework was able to help us give three different sub areas: access to healthcare services, quality of healthcare services in the community, and disadvantage. And we're talking about primary healthcare over here in the communities, and the lady health worker program, basically, or the BHU services, basic health units. And then equity in services, i.e. is it the same for within their household? Is it the same for them versus their husband, daughters versus sons, versus them and other more women who do have out-of-pocket health expenses? So once we had this, we were able to identify which standardized scales we would use, what questions we needed to modify and include for regional relevancy, build a survey, and then continue other aspects of our research. We then also needed to, in your research proposal, you need to have a clear problem statement. Because if you don't have a problem statement and then you're not building research questions and a hypothesis around this, then it's useless, because you've not identified that a problem exists. Now, the literature review was able to tell us that women microfinance borrowers in Pakistan are suffering from impoverishment. They are stuck in debt cycles, non-stop repeat loan taking and debt. They are suffering from physical and mental health issues. They are receiving substandard public health services from the primary sector or none at all. And the microfinance service delivery that is taking place in the communities is very commercialized. Their concern is to get their loan back, and they're charging high installment rates, whereas the original Grameen model of microfinance for poor women was based on a social development ethic, which is providing skill and development, not just giving the loan, but simultaneously partnering loan provision with skill development, training, accountancy skills, health provision, health insurance and savings schemes provision by the microfinance sector, etc. Now, this helped us to identify more questions for the microfinance sector, who was actually delivering services in the community, i.e., what is their loan package portfolio? Is it just loan and taking back an installment, or are they following the Grameen model and also delivering social development services? So what was our aim? Our aim was to understand what kind of health challenges, physical and mental, women loan takers were facing. And also a secondary question, we had primary questions and secondary questions. Secondary question was how they were faring overall on quality of life related to their family relations, business development, future prospects, decision making for their children's marriages and their daughters going to higher education, etc. We also had a separate subsection for significance of study, which I think I mentioned earlier. And then we went into macro over here, that it was not just the women that we were concerned with, but we were also concerned about completing the research and advising policy sector improvement and loan portfolio improvement for the microfinance loan sector in Pakistan, which is being regulated by the Securities Exchange Commission Pakistan and also SBP, State Bank Pakistan. So basically, the NGOs and the institutes are regulated by SECP, and the banks, microfinance banks, are regulated by SBP. So there's quite a bit of complication. And when I was writing my report, also one of my articles still has not been published, by the way. Three have been published and one remains. I had a lot of recommendations for SECP, SBP, and the poverty alleviation sector of Pakistan, the government of Pakistan. And sometimes these are very controversial articles and findings and advice. So local journals, I don't know whether they would publish it. I don't know how receptive they would be. And these are complications and that all researchers face. And then a second very important macro area that was public health sector reform, i.e., if we were able to answer our research questions and identify that physical and mental health problems existed for such women, poor, impoverished, debt-ridden, loan-taking women, then what kind of primary level services for mental and physical health rehabilitations, um, um, care provision was necessary in the community and primary level? And does there need to be a partnership with the employment sector? So, for example, are the husbands who are employed in the local community also receiving health insurance for their women, for their wives? Are the women finance sector borrowers also receiving health insurance and life insurance from the microfinance sector, especially considering that they are home-based employees, so they are informal sector employees? So there was a lot of areas that we were able to identify in the significance of the study, that once we have our findings, we will not only be able to share cross-sectional data about women's situation, but we will also be able to advise the microfinance sector and the public health sector, or the primary health sector. So we then also had to obviously identify our specific research questions and our hypothesis. I haven't pasted, I had about 12 to 14 in the proposal, but I've only, as a sample, summarized some over here. So one of our research questions was, which helped us to build two related hypotheses, was that is there a relationship between the social development features of microfinance providers and the improvement in health and poverty alleviation of women? And based on this, the hypothesis was, are microfinance providers providing loans to women without mandatory social development features, such as specifically savings, insurance, health insurance, and skill development training? And hypothesis number two, are women loan borrowers or microfinance not gaining with regard to health or poverty alleviation due to these lack of social development features not provided by the microfinance provider, or then provided by them? And so then that way we had two columns, those who were provided the social development features and how their poverty alleviation and health standards were, versus those who were not provided. And we, by the way, found that even the minimal provision, well, I won't get into findings right now unless we have time later on. So we also then have to have in your research proposal and justification for your sampling and selection criteria. The basis for this is obviously to first
Dr.
define
Sarah?
your population. So there are about 2 to 4.5. Yes, Anish, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. There is one suggestion by one of the participants. They're asking you to speak a bit slowly. Um, that is pauses among the words. And then there are two questions. One is by Miss Mahin Zia. She's asking that how do we identify the areas needing further research? Um, and I'll get to the other question if you want to answer this one first. Dr. Sarah, are you with us?
Okay.
I
Dr.
think
Sarah?
we have lost her. Ask her to reconnect again, if she can hear us. यहीं बैठी है कि she is doing it from her office.
She's doing it from her home, I think.
अच्छा. So उनको सेल पे मैसेज भेज दें कि इसको कट ऑफ करके दोबारा ज्वाइन करें.
Okay.
Maheen Zia, if I may take your question, how do you identify areas needing further research? तो इसमें you have to identify areas needing further research on your when you do a review of literature. तो आपको पता लग जाता है what are the areas that have already been researched, and it depends on what the proposal demands. That actually identifies the areas of research. But if you are doing your own research proposal and you're planning for a research yourself, and then you want to, usually I have noticed people start with a question and they have a research question. Are you back on, Sarah?
Yes,
Hello?
I am, and I have.
Okay.
I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I don't.
Not at all.
Yes.
Not at all. This happens.
I
Please take the question. How do you identify areas needing further research? And then there are a couple of other questions.
I've shared the rights with you.
Yeah, we've already made. Right. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
So you can, so we've already addressed that when you identify a funding body, they will provide you with their own template and subheadings. But another way to go about it, because we all want to write the research proposal before, is to use this typical flow, which I've actually included in the presentation. And that's actually what I was taking you through one by one. So you start with your theoretical framework, then you talk about your statement of the problem. All of this comes from the literature review, by the way. This is basically a breakdown of your literature review. Aim of study, significance of study. And then when you mention review of literature over here, this is now actually review of studies that have been done. But that doesn't mean that you don't get your theoretical framework and statement of problem also from your literature review. The next big section is basically your research questions and hypothesis development, or your objectives, or what you actually intend to do with the intervention, action research, or if it's a desk literature review or whatever you're doing. And then the big section is your methodological section, which is going to discuss your sampling, your selection criteria, what instruments you're going to be using for data collection or intervention or whatever, or if it's a desk review, because somebody just recently shared a proposal with me where they won a grant, a very small grant for a desk review or a systematic literature review. So here again, instead of the operationalization or instrument, you will share your plan for which databases you will be using for your systematic literature review, PubMed, Scopus, etc. Then your data collection plan, your data analysis projection, which tests you will be using, what parametric tests you will be using, and then a limitations and a scope for future section, and then finally your timeline, budget, and plans for dissemination. So I'll take a pause. And is this clear about which sections you should be writing for your research proposal?
I think Sarah, what she wanted to know was
Yeah.
what about, I think there was something else. It was
Okay.
wanting to know how do you identify areas needing further research, but that are the areas that are probably specified in a
Yeah.
proposal. There are already,
Yeah.
some areas for further research is what the proposal will already demand, that this is the purpose of the proposal that you are writing. So I am surprised. Would you like to clarify, Maheen? What do you mean by this? Would you like to, just if you unmute and please state your question or clarify, what do you mean? Publish the need for research. I mean, how do you publish anything that has not been researched before and you think it will be helpful is you need to put up research to publish. Those are the areas you research in. And publications always demand certain types of researches. And so there are guidelines by those publication journals or wherever you want to publish. They will give you a template for what they want, what sort of research they want. But if I am not making myself clear, would you like to ask the question yourself, Maheen?
Yes. I'm very sorry if the language, if the, my question wording, there is something wrong with that. I think I didn't make myself clear enough.
Yes.
So basically, my question is that how do you identify the areas? For example, there is this body, there is this organization that is giving loans to women, and I want something to be done in that area. So what is the first step? How would I exactly identify? Is the need identification the first step, or is it something, an idea that's popping into your head regarding that research, and then you are approaching them, or it can go both ways, or I mean, what goes first and what goes next? I hope I have made myself clear.
Yeah, this is a great question. The first part of the question was that, I mean, here we covered, did you join late? Maybe you did join late. We covered this in detail in the beginning, that if you take a look at HEC's site, they have a comprehensive long list of national priority areas. There is nothing that is excluded over here if you take a look at this carefully. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah, there you go. So here, if you take a, but then going back to what you're saying, and I think what you're asking is what's important, your passion versus a funding opportunity. And I would say it goes both ways. Sometimes there's a funding opportunity, you think you have a team and it's going to work, so you draft a proposal. But it can also work the other way. You want to work in a specific area, you've prepared the proposal, and then you start seeking for funding opportunities. Does that answer the question? So really, it works both ways.
Yeah, true.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Sara and Dr. Khana.
Yeah.
Are there more
There's
questions?
another question by Asif Sami. He says, what is the role of a data analyst in writing a proposal?
Oh God, that's very important. I was reaching there. So if you notice over here, when we have a data analysis plan, when you write your team principal investigators and you introduce them, so SRJ will be responsible for this, da will be responsible for this. It's amazing to have an actual social scientist or a statistician on the team with you, and they will be sharing their index formulas, which will be part of your proposal. So if I don't know whether I have the time, but if I have the time, I'll open my proposal and I'll show you that the formulas come from them, right? You can't just say, well, I'm going to do multiple regression and just end it there. You're going to have to tell them what your independent variables are. If you yourself are a statistician, it helps. Like I do social statistics as well, but I usually also get a statistician on my team so that we are backups for each other. So you clearly in your data analysis section should be identifying different elements related to reliability, peer conformability, which will be your dependent versus independent variables, which will be your control variables, your p-value significance, whether your confidence intervals will be reported, which scales and the items we will be compounding, and what your formulas will be. So So if we have the time, I can open one of my proposals that just got accepted, development and compounding statistics for women and health index indicator. But that's very important. That's key, by the way, because if they know that you have, because without a data analysis section and a social scientist or a statistician on your team,
Yeah.
you're not going to be able to actually publish anything at the end of the day. You won't be
Yeah.
able to do anything with your data.
Yeah.
You just have data
Yeah.
and you won't know how to analyze it.
Yeah, but in a research proposal, I think long before your process comes in, when you are planning on how you're going to take your methodology going and the process going, I think a data analyst will be the right person to tell you that for a certain type of data and the responses that you want, what type of platform is most applicable. Is it in vivo? Is it SPSS? What angles of an SPSS would be applicable? Because there are times when you might not need actually a certain type of platform or data analysis that you are thinking about. So a data analyst well in time may warn you that this becomes superfluous since you are not required to do this. So I think, yes, a data analyst, like Sarah said, is an inherent part of the process, but is very, very timely to know where to go with the, how do you want to analyze the data in the early part of your proposal writing. Is there any other question, Anish? I think those are it. You may continue, please, with your, if there's something left. I see there are some sessions left. We have launched the whole Sarah. And because usually people start leaving, within the last 10 minutes. So we thought it's better to launch the poll right now. And if 2 minutes are up, Anish, we may close it.
Right. So I'll just try to continue a little. There's just a few slides left about the sections in your research proposal. So you need to define your sampling, and you need to do it very carefully with the proper statistical formula. Otherwise, again, you can face rejection simply because your sample does not represent the population.
Yeah.
I was just mentioning that there are, for example, 4.5 million microfinance borrowers. So that figure was needed to enter into the sample calculator. This is basically an example of the beginning of a tool. Obviously, it's much longer than this, but this also ties into the previous question, i.e., how important is the statistician in your team? They're very important because some of these questions may be inaccurate. Their response categories may not be appropriate for applying regression. Maybe some questions are missing in the independent variables compounding list. And this is why so, and remember, this appendix is something that goes with your research proposal. But if some items are missing and you can't actually perform data analysis because you missed key independent variables, then it's your statisticians who are going to point that out to you. So that's why they're very important initially in your team. Otherwise, you might actually go and collect data and you've not collected data on 2-3 variables. You can't go back and collect that data. And then obviously you need specialists in the team who know state SPSS and in vivo. Usually with big research proposals, you're collecting both data. So you're going to be using the quantitative software, SPSS and S data, and you'll be using the qualitative software in vivo. And so you need researchers with you who have experience in both. And your principal investigator should have experience in both. Otherwise, that's a big weakness of when you're submitting your proposal. What your data collection plan is, you can see in the table over here, identifying the provinces, what their specific weightage is in the national population versus how many of them you will be actually sampling in your study. And then the individual cities have also been mentioned. And then you can include a map in your proposal. Just make sure that there are no copyright issues and you're using a publicly accessible map. We talked about data analysis already, and so small sections related to your limitations and your risk forecasting, how you will ensure that risks are minimized. There are always risks and limitations to every research, so please don't write that there are no limitations to my research. And finally, an ethics section is very important. In fact, I've been a reviewer for HEC, and this is something that I zoom in on first personally. Research ethics is primary. And whether you put this section at the top of your methodology or at the bottom, but it should be there. You don't omit it. And sometimes that also makes a big difference between acceptance versus rejection. So this is your budget. You can see here that I've used the NRPU HEC budget headings. So usually, just like you'd be given a template for your research heading sections, you would also be given a budget template. Even if you do, and you can also access this. This presentation will be shared by Anish, but you can also access this. It's open access. So just write HEC budget plan, and you can see that it has nice formulas. It takes a little bit of time to get the hang of it, but you'll be filling one column in and the next columns will just start populating themselves. So be careful of the formulas that you don't delete it. And it has yearly plans for your budget depending on how long your project is for. And this is a nice Gantt chart which shows quarter-wise time uh, planning for your research project and the main elements. So the first column has the main elements of your research tasks, like finalization of the tools, purchasing of the smartphones, collection of the baseline data, and then the relevant quarters or 3 months where you will be completing that task. Another extension to this Gantt chart is to actually include the principal investigators or co-investigators who are working on this plan. And that really helps to monitor the intervention and prepare quarterly audit reports as well. Remember that when you receive a research proposal grant, you're also going to be responding to your research grant institute and staying in touch with them with quarterly audit reports. And so what I do usually is open a Google shared drive, which has a daily plan. And on a weekly basis, all principal investigators write down what they've been doing. And then that becomes a sum, and that's easier than sitting at the end of 6 months or 3 months or at the end of the year, depending on when your grant institute asks you for an audit report. Instead of writing it in one go later on, writing it every day a little bit helps in compiling that report. That's key. And even mentioning who will be in charge of your audit report and your timelines in your proposal is very important in an organogram. So usually the template of the grant allocations asks you for an organogram. So don't just have your principal investigator teams mentioned there. Also have the team members mentioned who are managing your IT, managing your Google surveys, managing your shared drive, managing your data entries, managing your audit report, etc., etc. And then the more detailed and comprehensive your organogram is, and your task list is, and your monitoring is, the higher probability of you receiving your grant, because they realize that you're organized and you're on top of things earlier on. So plans for dissemination, this should be communicated as well. And these are my references. I'll stop for more questions, please. I can see the comment by Mahi.
I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of.
Yeah.
I don't think there are any questions anymore, Sarah.
Okay. Oh, my video was off. You didn't tell me, Anish. I got disconnected twice. I'm so sorry about this.
Yeah, that is why with the video off, you have a better chance of staying connected, actually.
Oh, yeah, I wish I
if you
had
put
done
your
that.
video off, your line usually doesn't use that much bandwidth and it's easier to continue. So we advise people to keep the videos off if their connection is not good.
Yeah.
So we don't see any other questions. I think it was a very comprehensive, expose. And as always, you have so much to share from your own experience, Sarah. That's a delight to get the information from a researcher, top class researcher like yourself. And it's a rarity, it's a treat really to listen to what you have to say. And you're talking with solid experience behind you. I think you're one of our most, regular researchers who is always researching and writing and publishing, right? You're never without it. from one into the other. So I don't see, there is some people are very thankful, insightful session. Thank you, Dr. Sarah. So there's lots of thanks for such an informative session. So I think we'll call it a day. Would you have like to add something, Sarah, towards the end?
Wanted to thank Dr. Ruxana for all her kind words and so being so generous and inviting me always to share. And I've learned a lot as well. Thank you, Anish. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, all the participants.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you all. See you till next time. I think we're meeting on a Wednesday. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Khudafis.
Bye.